Well, as they say in life, timing is everything. Good evening, and thank you to all of you for coming. On behalf of the VCDMP, I am extremely pleased to welcome His Excellency and Most Excellent Tom Countryman, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. I don't know about you, but I could listen to Tom speak about almost any subject, given his breadth of knowledge and eloquence, not to mention his terrific sense of humor, which is why I actually invited him to speak about anything he wished. It's the humor part, actually. He suggested that it might be timely, in his own understated fashion, to discuss the domestic political roots of the Trump White House's approach to nuclear negotiations with Iran and North Korea, and the dangers each of these situations poses to regional security and the global non-proliferation regime, under a quintessentially Tom-like title, When to Talk and When to Walk. While most of us are aware of the circumstances surrounding Tom's departure from the U.S. Department of State in January last year, there are some other aspects of Tom's career about which you may be less well aware. Tom joined the State Department in 1982, and his first foreign posting was at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade, where he met and fell in love with his wife of 30-some years. He spent 2 years studying Arabic and Arab culture and was subsequently posted to the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. He now speaks 6 languages: Serbo-Croatian, Arabic, Italian, Greek, and German, and English. Sometimes. And I bet many of you are thinking, wow, and he's American, you know? How are you? After working in the Office of Counterterrorism, he was appointed in 1994 as Special Advisor to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, during which time he also served as the U.S. liaison to the UN Special Commission on Iraq. Tom moved to the White House in 1997, it's too bad he's not still there, as the Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, followed by a stint as the Director of the State Department's Office of South Central European Affairs. The U.S. government then decided to post Tom to a couple of hardship duty stations, 4 years in Rome as a political officer and 3 years as DCM and Chargé in Athens. Tom is quite soft-spoken and not given to self-promotion, but he has gotten around, and I particularly like the picture of him on his Wikipedia page that is simply subtitled, Countryman Removes Landmines from Afghanistan 2010. In September 2011, the U.S. Senate confirmed President Obama's nomination of Tom as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. In October 2016, he was also appointed to succeed Rose Gottemuller as the Undersecretary of State for International Security Affairs. You may recall that shortly thereafter, there was a small election in the United States. This ultimately led to Tom's triumphant departure from the State Department when, as they so politely say in diplomatic speak, he was relieved of his duties by the President. Rereading Tom's poignant farewell address to his colleagues in the State Department in January last year, I was struck by a passage that I thought might resonate with the people here tonight. Forgive me for quoting you, Tom. Business made America great, as it has always been, and business leaders are among our most important partners. But let's be clear, despite the similarities, a dog is not a cat, baseball is not football, and diplomacy is not a business. Human rights are not a business, and democracy is most assuredly not a business. Before I give Tom the floor, may I ask you please to turn off your phones or put them on silent, and your recording devices, please. We will be recording Tom's talk, and we will be posting it on our website, but we will not be filming the the question and answer part of this. So please, if you would observe that, that would be lovely. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Tom. When he finishes, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So Tom, what about the news today?
Well, That was a huge introduction, full of hyperbole. I know you've gone to a lot of trouble organizing this. I know there's a lot of people here tonight expecting a good speech, but I have this letter from the President announcing the cancellation of tonight's event. We could proceed anyway. So let me thank Laura for organizing this. The Vienna Center continues to do outstanding work educating not just the people who most need education, that is today's diplomats, but also educating the next generation of diplomats and doing a fantastic job of it. And I want to thank the Permanent Mission of Japan for opening this space, and also the folks who paid me to come to Vienna, or paid my air ticket, that is the CTBTO, the Science Diplomacy Symposium that I've attended today and where I'll speak tomorrow is again a fantastic opportunity for expanding public consciousness about what we need to do to reduce the threat of nuclear war. So, the topic is a lot of fun. And what is especially fun in my very relaxed retirement is to employ a lot of the skills that I learned as a diplomat serving in other countries, analyzing the motivations, political, economic, and psychological, of foreign governments to be able to explain them to Washington, and now using the same tools to try to understand the way that Washington operates today. It is without doubt a fun time to be a non-U.S. diplomat in Washington. A U.S. diplomat in Washington, not so much fun. And so I'll try to explain some of the domestic roots of the answer to this question. With so many similarities between the situation with North Korea and the situation with Iran, why has there been, at least until today, a very different approach on the part of the Trump administration? I think you understand the similarities well. Both North Korea and Iran have long fostered a national narrative that points at the United States as the root of all evil, the cause of all their problems, the justification, the legitimacy of their national government. It is an attitude that a government must have an enemy, an unfortunate attitude that is now reflected in Washington as well. Both governments have serious human rights violations. Both governments resort to the barbaric practice of taking citizens hostage as political bargaining chips. Both threaten their neighbors, as well as the U.S., with overheated rhetoric. And both, of course, have pursued nuclear weapons programs, North Korea proceeding far further than Iran in that regard. So why is there a difference in the Trump administration's approach? The simple answer could be because North Korea had already succeeded in developing nuclear weapons, and there's a certain amount of truth to that. But that is not the only difference. First, Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to undo the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. He criticized it as the worst deal ever negotiated at a time when that was the point of view of the majority of American citizens. It was a resonant campaign theme for him. Now, the fact that the view has switched and that 60% of Americans in the latest survey before the president's decision wanted to maintain the JCPOA doesn't change the fact that the president made a campaign promise. And whatever else you may say about him, he has been intent on, if not keeping all of his promises, keeping the ones that are relatively less painful for him to keep, and then publicizing that fact ignoring the other ones that he hasn't kept. Campaign promises mean something in the United States. The second reason is more psychological and related to the first, and that is the president's obsession with his predecessor, Barack Obama, and a determination to undo any significant achievement or step that President Obama made, even if there is no replacement plan, even if there is no follow-up strategy. And a great example that you may not be familiar with is the president and his allies in Congress have not killed the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare, but they've chipped away at it enough so that the net result is that the federal government is spending about $30 billion a year more in order to cover several million fewer people with health insurance. That's what you get when you simply choose to undo without having a follow-up plan. But more important than just being a plan to undo Obama achievements, he's got a recognition that in the case of North Korea, no U.S. president has succeeded in a long-lasting agreement with North Korea. And therefore, it's unexplored territory, and it can be an issue that Donald Trump can own. And this is part of what explains the fact that he responded so readily when Kim Jong-un reached out and first talked about a face-to-face meeting. But I think a still more important one, and one that has to do with more classical political analysis rather than psychological analysis, is the fact that the states, the foreign partners that were pushing him to abrogate the JCPOA, are states that have gone out of their way to appeal to his ego, to lobby him particularly hard on this issue. And let me quote from my friend Mark Fitzpatrick at IISS just for a moment. He says, America's partners in Europe and elsewhere would surely be pleased if Iran accepted all 12 demands that Mr. Pompeo laid out. But most partners do not believe that Iran is uniquely at fault in the region or that it threatens their vital national interests. The fact is that only 4 states share this view. Bahrain, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Emirates have good reason for concern, and as the states that feel directly threatened by Iran, their views deserve extra consideration. But they comprise a small minority, and none of them is itself beyond reproach. In other words, the president listened more attentively to the 4 states that are most directly threatened or concerned about Iranian threats, rather than a greater number of states in Europe and elsewhere who believed that the dangers, the risks in the Middle East had been constrained by the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. So that's a very simple view of some of the factors that led to the president's decision of May 12th. What lies ahead of us? And here, of course, I'll have to change notes that I've made over the last couple of days. But I'll talk first about North Korea, because as fast as the news comes about North Korea, in fact, it is an old story with a familiar script and a few new characters and a few new plot twists. The situation with Iran and the implications with Iran are much newer and much more dangerous for the region and for the world. Let me say a few of the things I intended to say and amend them as I go through. First of all, I was prepared to say that postponement of this summit was unlikely. These, after all, are, after the death of Stephen Hawking, the two greatest geniuses in the world. The two biggest television stars in the world. And it seemed unlikely to me that either of them would want to pass up the opportunity to be on global television, particularly Kim Jong-un, who has achieved with Donald Trump what his father and grandfather asked for and never got, a meeting with the United States president. The reasons why I was not only optimistic that the meeting would occur, but optimistic about its prospects for success, were first the very skilled diplomacy of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, whose interests are more directly at stake than those of the United States, has played a very smart, subtle, diplomatic game in seeking to stick as close as possible to its principal ally, the United States, and ensuring that in any meeting between the U.S. and North Korea, it would not only be U.S. interests that are protected, but South Korea interests protected as well. Secondly, the second reason for that I had some optimism is I think it is possible, it is not at all certain, that in fact Kim Jong-un is ready to make a major change in direction. Having achieved the assignment left to him by his father, developing a credible nuclear weapons capability, having achieved the goal of being treated as an equal by the US president, he may be at the point where he is ready to turn to what he always said was his next priority, which is economic development in North Korea. And third, the reason I was optimistic is that Donald Trump had taken a risk for peace. And for this, I do not criticize him. It was the right decision. We were in a situation until the early part of this year in which the US and North Korea were sleepwalking towards at least a conventional conflict, if not a nuclear conflict. And to stop, take a deep breath, and to say that talking is better, talking directly face to face is better than the rhetoric exchanged via electronic media, is safer for the world. He did the right thing, and I have supported him and wished him luck for this. I think we could have been optimistic, not for a comprehensive agreement, not for 130 pages like the JCPOA, maybe not even for the 4 or 5 pages that had marked the agreed framework and the joint statement and our previous documents with North Korea, but at least a short statement from these two leaders that said, we have agreed on the goals, which are complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a long-term peaceful relationship. And if it only said those 2 sentences, and then said, here is how we will pursue it over the next 1 year or 2 years, or ideally within a time limit. And we will base this on the principle of action for action. They could have begun with immediate steps and then agreed rapidly on intermediate steps. Immediate steps could have included a verifiable freeze by North Korea of both nuclear tests and of ballistic missile tests, including space launches. It could have included, again on the North Korean side, as an immediate or intermediate step, verification of their fissile material production capability. It could even have, if Kim was feeling daring, a signature of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would be an effective way of putting some pressure on the United States as well. From the United States side, there could have been immediate and intermediate steps that included a clear statement of non-aggression or promise of no military action against North Korea, could have included an agreement to scale down or suspend joint military exercises with the ROK, at least during the period of negotiations. There could have been a set of steps agreed. I don't believe that these two gentlemen in a single day could have choreographed all those steps, but they could have set the framework that their teams would follow up. The hardest part would have been the single question of when does sanction relief begin? The White House has been staking out its position that sanctions relief begins only once the process of denuclearization is complete. North Korea, not as loudly, of course, has had the position that sanctions relief begins as a symbol of goodwill at the start of the process, and that would have been the single hardest part of a successful summit, is to define the point at which sanctions relief would actually begin. Now, that's what could have happened. Here's the things that I wrote down yesterday and today about how it might not only be unsuccessful, but how it could all go terribly wrong. And number one was a reversion to unrestrained rhetoric by both sides that forces one or the other to cancel. And that, of course, is exactly what we had today. And I'll come back to what we think happened today. The second was a lack of preparation on the U.S. side. I have no doubt that Kim Jong-un would have been very well prepared for this meeting. I have no doubt that the best officials at the State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA would have prepared a massive book that would have psychological analyses, political analyses, charts, graphs, scary pictures of missiles, and could provide that to the president. I have no confidence that he would read more than the first page. There is no topic of domestic or international politics so far on which Mr. Trump has shown an aptitude for extended study. The third way it could have gone wrong, even before today, would have been, and this is perhaps the most important, a complete misunderstanding between the two about what the term denuclearization means. It's fairly clear from the statements of President Trump over the last couple of months that it just means you give up all your nuclear weapons right now. The North Koreans have not really moved from the definition of denuclearization that they have used for many years, which it is a process that involves not only North Korean nuclear assets, it includes U.S. strategic assets. The U.S. has no nuclear weapons in South Korea, has not had them for more than 20 years, but it likes to fly strategic bombers close to North Korea at times. An implicit nuclear threat, if you will. The fact that this definition was so different between the two could easily have led to a breakdown on the first day, and I think is in fact one of the reasons there was finally a realization in the White House how far apart they were on this issue. One of the reasons that led to where we are today. And the other way it could have gone wrong, although it might still be labeled by Mr. Trump as a success, is if he went into a meeting looking only after United States interests and ignoring the interests of our very good, very valued allies, the Republic of Korea and Japan. And there are several scenarios in which the president could have undermined those alliances in order to get a deal and handed an unnecessary victory to North Korea. Now, none of that, of course, is what happened. Instead, we have the problem of the two sides going back to the kind of unrestrained rhetoric that prevented any kind of meaningful negotiations up to this point. And there's plenty of blame for this on both sides. I think the statements by the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, about the Libya model were not well chosen. The statement by Vice President Pence, where he extended Bolton's remarks about the Libyan model to go beyond 2003, which I think Bolton meant to talk about. 2003 is when the U.S., it was actually my old bureau at the State Department, ISN, brought a big cargo plane into Libya and picked up the various pieces of centrifuges that the Libyans were still trying to assemble and flew them out of the country. A tiny, incipient program that had gone nowhere. But Mr. Bolton implied, and Mr. Pence said, the Libyan model is not just about 2003, it's about 2011, where a dictator meets a brutal, violent end. That was a dumb thing to say. And the North Koreans were not wrong to say that was a stupid thing to say. It was unnecessary for them to go on and insult the vice president by name again and again. And it led to today's action by Mr. Trump to cancel the summit for June 12th. One thing that is interesting is that both Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim have stopped the personal insults directed against each other. And I think that's very intentional on both sides. Mr. Kim has learned from the Chinese and the Saudis and others that flattery of Donald Trump is the key to any kind of progress. And I think they'll probably stick to that. And Mr. Trump reciprocated in his message back to Mr. Kim today. I will not make a prediction tonight about whether or when this meeting gets rescheduled. But just thinking about it for the last couple of hours, I would say there are still reasons to be optimistic. And there are still reasons for the world not simply to throw up its hands and laugh. It's very tempting. It is, you know, if you like basketball or football, you know that amateur sports is always more fun than professional sports. But it's not just about that. There is a genuine possibility left open in Mr. Trump's letter that this can still proceed. And I hope that the world's leaders, particularly those who have invested the time and the kind words to build a relationship with Mr. Trump, urge him to adopt a policy of patience, to take the time to use his Secretary of State, his diplomats, to explore further the conditions that would allow this meeting to proceed, that they take the time, that he imposes some discipline on his own team in talking about North Korea, that he asks the North Koreans to do the same, and that is best done, by the way, a lot of you are diplomats and know this already, by a private message rather than a public message. And to encourage the president and the North Koreans to recognize that a comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a long-term goal that's in the interests of the entire world. To achieve it requires a negotiating framework. It requires the kind of setting goals, phased reciprocal steps that are required, and it is not achieved by either the threat of military action or by the promise of billions of dollars in new hotels after North Korea has done everything. There's a positive message out there, and I would hope that the allies and friends of both countries would work to calm the atmosphere and remind them of what the necessary steps are. That's the happy news. Let's talk about Iran. Mr. Trump's decision to violate not only the JCPOA, and I use the term violate, there's nothing in the JCPOA that says you can withdraw. You can either honor it or violate it. And the United States was the first of the 7 nations that chose to violate it. Violating, by the way, at the same time, a binding United Nations Security Council resolution that had been unanimously adopted. In his decision to violate the JCPOA, the President made a number of incorrect statements, to put it politely, about the content of the JCPOA, and in particular about the duration of the most important aspects of the JCPOA. The most important things Iran had agreed that would give all the world confidence that it could not pursue a nuclear weapon in the future. And these technical requirements are so solid and so detailed and so painfully negotiated, and yet the President and his advisors are never able to talk about these. The President's actions, I have to say, also followed a long set of negotiations with the 3 European parties to the deal, UK, France, and Germany. And I think that those countries are correct in feeling that those long negotiations were never conducted in good faith by the United States, that the intent was always to get to this point. But perhaps the greatest concern about the President's decision is that it was taken without any advance thought of the follow-on diplomatic approach. And this was fairly clear from the briefings that both White House and State Department officials gave immediately after the President's decision, where it was obvious there was no plan B, that they were going to start writing it that night. The result of this was the speech that Secretary Pompeo gave this week, in which he made 12 demands of Iran. And let's talk not so much about the substance of those very sweeping demands, but about how best to characterize them. The Secretary says these are the minimum requirements of basic civilized behavior. And he's not wrong. Points about not pursuing nuclear weapons when you have made an agreement, the NPT, not to do so. Points about non-interference in other countries' affairs. Points about non-support for terrorism. These are, in fact, in several points in the 12 demands, basic norms of international behavior. The 12 demands go far beyond that, of course. They do raise a question that you will not find answered by an administration official. One is, why are the U.S. demands of North Korea limited only to the nuclear field and not to all 12 of the same types of activity that is demanded of Iran? Or an even tougher question, if we are concerned about non-use of cyber attacks, non-interference in other countries, non-occupation of other people's territory, why do we not make these demands of the Russian Federation a part of arms control discussions. After all, there are U.S. allies, formal U.S. allies, who feel every bit as threatened by the Russian occupation of territory in Georgia and Ukraine, and by cyber attacks by the Russian government upon other governments. Why is the U.S. willing to separate out those topics from all the other topics we have to do with Russia? There is no good answer to these questions. There's a reason, but there's not a good answer. So for the Trump administration, they call these basic civilized behavior. Who could be opposed to it? And it gives them the additional talking point, so popular in the last 2 years. Anybody who disagrees with our definition of civilized behavior is defending uncivilized behavior. Well, let's be very clear. Nobody in the political opposition in the United States, nobody in the arms control community, nobody in Europe is happy with the actions that Iran takes to destabilize the neighborhood. Nobody supports those or endorses those. But there are other characterizations of these 12 demands. One way to characterize them is total surrender. In other words, the United States is demanding everything from Tehran except conversion to Christianity. A complete change, not just in their foreign policy, but in the regime itself. And that's unlikely to happen. My colleague John Wolfstall, in a very excellent piece he wrote, described it as a pipe dream, something that simply cannot be achieved. My own description for it is that it is all-out economic warfare against the Islamic Republic without a sufficiently defined goal. Unfortunately, the United States occasionally engages in warfare, economic and otherwise, without thinking through the end state that they are seeking to achieve. So let's talk about economic warfare, or maximum pressure, as the Trump administration likes to say. I believe in sanctions as a tool of diplomacy, and I believe in them because they are a non-military tool of diplomacy. But sanctions are strong when they are universally applied, when the goal is clear, and when there is a clear readiness to end sanctions once that goal is achieved. None of those conditions are true in this case, and therefore this form of economic warfare is unlikely to be effective. I recall for you how the Obama administration built a coalition, a global coalition, that was willing to take economically painful steps in order to make the economy painful for Iran. There was no such willingness on the part of the world to join the Bush administration in doing this, because the Bush administration, number one, was refusing to talk to Iran. And at the point in 2006, when it was ready to do so and ready to join the Europeans, it could not abandon as a precondition that the goal of negotiations with Iran would be an end to all enrichment. Between 2010 and 2013, the Obama administration built a different coalition by saying two things. First, publicly saying it's ready to make a deal with Iran, and privately saying, not at the outset, but by about 2013, 2014, to its negotiating partners, including Iran, that there could be a deal that included enrichment under tight controls. That approach by Obama not only led to UN Security Council action, it led to a result that I did not believe possible, which was a European Union decision to restrict oil imports from Iran at a time, recall, when the European economy was not doing terribly well. And it included, tacitly, not explicitly, even China in cutting back oil imports from Iran. There is no possibility that that coalition can be rebuilt today. The EU does not accept the US reasoning. I do not see any likelihood that China will feel compelled to cut imports from Iran the way it did before. There is no backing from the United Nations Security Council for such an effort. In fact, it flies directly against a binding decision by the Security Council. So if it doesn't succeed, what will be the effects of this approach by the Trump administration? It's not going to be an immediate crisis. And I say this not because it's not serious. I say it because I'm getting very tired of the Trump White House. Every time he does something irrational, to be polite, the next day they say, see, our opponent said that the world would end, that everything would be terrible. But look, nothing's happened. The sun still rose. This is going to be a long, rolling, slow boiling crisis. And it's going to get harder and harder for everybody involved. But a couple of the things that you should worry about as the direct effects of this US economic warfare. One that's interesting and that's talked about, but I think in the end is not terribly important, is energy supply. That is, oil supply and oil price. It is clear that Iran's oil export capability, and recall that Iran only got back last year to the level of oil exports that it had been at 10 years previously. It's not going to immediately go back down to where it was in 2013. It will gradually decline, and that will be economically painful for Iran. In a normal market, which the oil market is not, that would lead to an increase in the price of oil. Nobody would be happier than Vladimir Putin about an increase in the price of oil. US voters would not be very happy about an increase in the price of gasoline. But I don't expect either of those to happen because the Saudis have made clear that they will make up the difference in total global input in order to stabilize prices. So energy is not a big thing. Within Tehran, and I know there are experts in this room who understand the political dynamics within Iran much better than I do. The Secretary of State likes to argue that this division between moderates and hardliners is false, that they're all hardliners in Iran. He's got a point, and the point is, if there is hostility against Iran, as in any other country with a highly developed sense of national pride, everybody becomes a hardliner. I think that it is likely that both the democratically elected government and the non-democratically elected real government, the real oligarchs who control most things, will at least temporarily come together. And as the economic sanctions begin to bite, they'll come together more strongly. What will not happen is that ordinary Iranians will say, by God, Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump are on our side. This is a time to press for more democracy and to be more like Europe and America. That is not a winning argument for anyone in Iran at this moment. And so the repeated statements of Secretary Pompeo that the Iranian citizens can make a different choice, that is, change their government. There's going to be a change of government in the United States before there is a change of government in Iran, and that's a simple fact. Perhaps the long-term effect that we really need to worry about is in my view, the increased possibility of military conflict in the Middle East. This is dismissed as hyperbole by the Trump administration spokesman, but it's not quite that simple. First, the president can't abandon, as we saw today in his letter to North Korea, the pleasure he gets from making threats. And even if the threats are not so terribly clear or explicit, when he says that resumed Iranian work towards a nuclear weapon will have the most serious consequences, that is intended to be understood as a military threat, no matter what the White House spokesperson says the next day. Another way to look at this is the Secretary of State's explanation that if Iran does all of these things, you have nothing to worry about from the United States. Now, the converse of that statement is intended to send a message to Iran as well. But what bothers me, and I think there's some folks in this audience as old as me, we remember 2002 and 2003. And the language used by the Trump White House today is disturbingly similar to the statements of Vice President Cheney about Iraq in 2002. The exaggeration of the capability of Iran to move rapidly towards a nuclear weapon is like the exaggeration about Saddam's WMD capabilities. The shading of intelligence, and shading is the most polite word I can use here, is very reminiscent of what the Bush White House did in 2002 and 2003. And the presence of Mr. Bolton, who was a central figure in that episode that led to the disastrous, the stupidest strategic step the U.S. has taken in the last 50 years, the invasion of Iraq, has within the last year, before he re-entered government, written that the most effective way to prevent Iran from having nuclear bombs is to bomb Iran. And he now has the president's ear. You add all that up, but it concerns me. It's not something that happens tomorrow, but it does concern me that the White House would not be unhappy if there were a provocation that could be blamed on Iran that required a military response. There's one very positive thing that happened today, and because it was today, nobody's noticed it yet. The U.S. House of Representatives, in debating the annual defense authorization bill, which is about the only bill that the Congress ever gets around to enacting these days, they had a vote on an amendment, and I just want to see if I can find the exact words of the amendment. I can't find the exact words, but it was unanimously adopted to say nothing in this defense authorization bill gives the president authority for military action against Iran. And there were no dissenting voices. And the Senate may well do the same thing. That's not enough, and that's not a guarantee. But it is a very different situation from congressional support for war against Iraq in 2002 and 2003. All right, I keep going on, but I still have more, sorry. A couple of notes. What should the European Union do, and what should Iran do? It is important for the European Union to make clear that it supports the JCPOA, it stands by its signature, it stands by the UN Security Council resolution, and that it will seek to preserve the economic benefits that accrue to Iran from strict adherence to the deal. Whether or not this includes a blocking statute, as the European Union has used before, or other steps to protect European companies, I have to leave to the EU. It will be difficult for 28 countries to agree on strong action. And it will be difficult in particular because a few EU members will be more hesitant than others to make such an open break with Washington. But I firmly believe it is important for the European Union to make the attempt to preserve this deal for as long as possible. Perhaps it won't succeed. Perhaps European companies, especially those companies that have major business with the United States, and keep in mind the EU's trade with the United States is about 100 times bigger than the EU's trade with Iran. Perhaps it won't succeed in preserving economic benefits, but for the EU's own credibility, it is crucial that it make the attempt. What should Iran do? And again, I am not an expert on Iranian domestic politics, but I'll give a little advice anyway. It's hard to give the advice because Iran at times can be the same as Pyongyang or Washington and respond irrationally, emotionally, with nasty rhetoric instead of calmly sitting and thinking, this is what we're going to do. It's going to be, what I would recommend that Iran does is first to focus on the European Union, as well as China and Russia, but especially the European Union, and see what reasonable steps by Iran would make it easier for the EU to uphold its end of the JCPOA. A more radical idea, and I know it's difficult, is why not refuse to be provoked? When people are trying to provoke you, the best thing you can do is refuse to be provoked. Why not say to the United States, okay, let's sit down. You have 12 demands, we have 11 demands of you. Let's talk about it. What Iran has at least momentarily accomplished by so far sticking with the JCPOA is to create a situation in which most of the world is lined up against the United States. And that in itself is not necessarily valuable, but it's a comfortable place to be, and you might want to stay there for a little while. Most importantly, keep in mind that although the United States cannot unilaterally destroy the JCPOA, once Iran says the JCPOA is dead, then it is dead. That is the point if Iran begins to cut back its cooperation with the IAEA, to reinstall centrifuges, to enrich uranium above 3.67%. That is the point where it's not Iran and the EU against Washington. Then it's half the world, including the EU and Washington, against Iran. And that's not a step to be taken lightly. Last part, some longer-term implications that concern me. One I've already mentioned, and that's about sanctions. As I said, sanctions are a valuable diplomatic tool. Using them wrongly can cause a situation that hurts your ability to use them in the future. And it's not just if sanctions are employed as an expression of antipathy towards a particular country rather than as a means to a particular goal. It's also the fact that if the rest of the world strongly disagrees with the way they are being used, it will accelerate the search for alternatives to the US dollar as being central to all international finance and trade. That will happen one day, and the more incentives Washington gives for it to happen, the sooner Washington becomes less important in sanctions enforcement. Second, I think even bigger than the implications for the Middle East are the implications for the transatlantic alliance. This is the most significant crisis in relations since 2003, since the Iraq War. It has Moscow smiling, no doubt. It builds upon other steps and statements that the Trump administration has made that are demeaning towards its European allies. It's not yet as big a crisis as in 2003, but note this, even in 2003, even Gerhard Schroeder, the harshest critic of the intervention in Iraq, was not saying it is time for a fundamental reassessment of the transatlantic alliance. It's time for Europe to define more clearly its leadership role in the world. That's the statements that are coming today from European Union leaders, and I'm very concerned about the implications of that, not just for European security, but for progress on a host of world issues. And then still more globally, this is the most significant action that will cause every partner in the world to wonder whether it is in their interest to sign any agreement with the United States. If the next US president can so easily back out of a deal that the rest of the world supports, that's endorsed by the Security Council, even if it has not been ratified by the US Senate, what is the point of signing anything? We could have an interesting discussion about whether Kim Jong-un recognizes that or not. But I think it will take a long time for the rest of the world to be again comfortable negotiating anything with the United States. And most globally is about the US role in setting the rules of the world. For the last 70 years, the United States has had unmatched influence in setting up the institutions, including the IAEA, including the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund and many other organizations, in setting up the rules about trade, about environment, about security in the OSCE and elsewhere. And the US has had that influence not only because of preponderant military and economic weight, but because it was willing to live up to the rules that it helped create. Not with perfect consistency. I'd be the first to admit that. But in general, it was not writing rules that said, the US will enforce these rules upon you and will make its own choices. But that is more or less what the Trump administration is doing today. These rules of the world order have been under attack from many sources for many years, whether it's Iran with support for terrorism, whether it's China, which built a successful economy upon the theft of technology and intellectual property, but benefited from the world's open trading system, whether it's the Russian Federation, which rejects its commitments in OSCE and takes action against its neighbors, both military and cyber. There is constant nibbling at the edges of rules that have served the entire world well. It is a fundamentally different world if it's not just Iran or Russia or China that is taking an approach that says we decide which rules we like and which ones we ignore. If it's the United States saying the same thing, we live in a fundamentally different world. As my colleague John Wolfstall likes to say, America can lead when we are trusted. Let me leave it there. I look forward very much to hearing alternative points of view or exploring some of these points. I remind you that the first part of my speech about North Korea was more optimistic than the second part, so please focus on that as well. But thank you, and we'll do questions and answers, but not on camera.